So you went to Jekyll Island, and the six names, the Nelson Aldrich, the Piat Andrew, Henry Davison, Arthur Shelton, Frank Vanderlip, Paul Warburg. Did you see all of those names there or no?
No. Let me go back. First of all, there is a picture of all of them there, but that came later, and that's in the main hall, the main eating area. But no, what I saw was Morgan's actual signature as someone who had been at Jekyll Island as one of the club members. So the way Jekyll Island worked, and this I also got information from their historian, is the way that Jekyll Island worked. It was a club. It was sort of, well, as he said, it was kind of like the first condominium for, like, the equivalent of billionaires at the time, where they would go with their families predominantly over the end of the year. So like a Thanksgiving, Christmas kind of a period. And there would be a tremendous count of, sort of servants to individuals. They basically had all the comforts that they would have sort of at home, but at Jekyll Island. They would close off the avenues to go to Jekyll Island. Now there's a highway kind of overhang, but then there wasn't. You had to come by boat. They would put posts throughout the town saying, this is closed, this is a period, people are going to be here, it's going to be closed. And you had to have a membership. So Henry Hyde, the Rockefellers, Morgan, this is not conspiratorial, this is in their history, to just come, to just physically walk onto that property from your boat at the time. And one of the things that happened at the time was you could have guests, but they had to be sponsored by an individual who had a club membership. And so what happened at the time was the commonality actually of JP Morgan was with Aldrich, and Aldrich's son actually, who was a New York banker at the time, but who wasn't involved in the six people. He just happened to have been a New York banker. He became, Winthrop Aldrich became the head of Chase for decades. But at that time he was not. But the point is there was that relationship, and it was Morgan that actually just had the pass. He wasn't there. He wasn't involved. He was not physically at all at Jekyll Island at that time that the origins of the Fed were being discussed. But he was the name on the book that was associated with these individuals. And so that's kind of how it came down. They would otherwise not have been able to just get physical access onto the property. And it's like any now, elite club thing. It's like you invite people in or they can't come in.
You're talking about six men apparently that control the quarter of the wealth of the world. That's the data that you hear about, so it's you read about it, but again, so a lot of people said it was a spoof about what the author wrote about him, and he said a lot of other things, but it's a story that picked up a lot of attention on how the world wealth is controlled by a few handful of people. How much do you buy into that?
Well, so these six people weren't necessarily all those people. What happened was, like, Frank Vanderlip, who was one of the people, was a sort of VP at National City Bank, which is now Citigroup. So, I mean, there are different people that were involved in the major banks at the time. So yes, there was an awful lot of money represented at that meeting. And Nelson Aldrich was the head of what we now consider the Senate Finance Committee. And so he was a very established senator, and he had been going back and forth to Europe around this time anyway to collect information for Congress to create a central bank. So it wasn't like that, this was all done at the spur of the moment. This was something that was sort of being done and sort of being analyzed for a while. But what happened was the plans, the blueprint that was created at Jekyll Island, that was then presented to Congress in 1910, and it was debated in Congress under Taft and then ultimately under Woodrow Wilson. Those blueprints were presented to Congress. And this is in the Congressional Archives. This is not, this just happened. And yeah, I have the footnotes in my book, but this was something that's actually occurred. Two of the bankers actually presented the idea to Congress initially because Nelson Aldrich actually had been ill for various reasons at the time, or at least that was said at the time. In fact, and this was in the New York Times at the time, he had been hit by a trolley car. If you can even imagine trolley cars going down Madison Avenue. But before he went to Jekyll Island, according to New York Times, he was actually in a trolley car situation. I don't know how badly he was hit, the article, but the point is, so anyway, he was convalescing throughout this period. He did not, because of that or other reasons, actually initially present the plan to Congress. It was presented by two of the bankers that were involved in those 6 people. So, yeah, whatever is said or not said, the facts of the situation was that there were those people, as we know historically, in that room, and as is currently up at Jekyll Island, which is now, a regular resort. It's been converted over the years. But the presentation of the initial blueprint for what became the Federal Reserve was presented initially by 2 of those people. And ultimately, it was passed several years later with a lot of back and forth from multiple bankers and multiple senators and multiple House of Representative Congress people to figure out how they could pass it in such a way that it was palatable to sort of the electorate, to the country. And one of the ways, yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I could go on and on.
Well, by the way, it's very interesting. So the audience is going to be curious about this. So how much of what is written in The Creatures of Jekyll Island is accurate, and how much of it is conspiracy?
Well, I think the accurate parts had to do with the travel down to Jekyll Island and how it was sort of done. I mean, it was done in a way to avoid publicity. Of course, publicity was different then than it is now. It wasn't 24/7. It was newspapers. Yeah. It was totally different. But so it was easier to do that. But the sort of clandestine way in which, the dead of night and all that kind of stuff, it's dramatic. It's kind of more dramatic in terms of the telling of the story. But that did happen. In fact, in Frank Vanderlip's notes, and his family has a foundation established library for basically his records. And he was a prolific writer. He had been a reporter actually before he became a banker. I did the opposite actually. I was a banker and now a reporter. But the point is that he actually, as do a number of those families, have notes and records that they kept very much for sort of posterity. There was a real sense back then, in particular in that part of the country and that part of our history, that they felt themselves to be bigger than themselves, in that they had to tell they wrote a lot about what was happening, much more than happens today. And so the story of going down and the people that went down and how it was done in a clandestine manner was from Vanderlip's own records. Now, he could have been embellishing it. That's entirely possible. I don't know. That was he's dead. But that I don't know. And in terms of how that book brought it up, again, it was more dramatic than even the dramatic telling of it by someone who was a reporter / writer before he became a banker. However, the actual mechanics of the story, the sitting down, the number of days that they were there, and he also wrote about what they ate and all kinds of stuff. I mean, he had some very Vanderlip, not in his own notes. That could have been for effect. I don't know. But the actions that occurred out of it, and the documents that came back to Congress, and the fights in Congress over the passage or not passage, or what it would look like and how it would go down, that all is pretty much, at least from my telling of it, in that I use the records themselves, information that's accessible to the public beyond the sort of more larger story that has kind of grown up around it.